My mother-in-law looked me dead in the eyes at my own engagement dinner and said, "We're just so glad Mark has finally found someone fun." She smiled when she said it. The kind of smile that knows exactly what it's doing. I should have listened to that smile. My name is Diane, and I'm 38 years old. I live in Calgary now, but 3 years ago I was living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Ottawa with my then fiancé Marcus, planning what I genuinely believed was going to be the rest of my life. I had a good job, project coordinator at a civil engineering firm downtown, benefits, pension, the whole thing. Marcus was a financial analyst at one of the banks on Spark Street. We'd been together 4 years. We had a joint savings account for the wedding. We had a venue booked at a heritage property out in the Gatineau Hills. We had napkin colours picked out, for God's sake. And his mother Patricia had been quietly, methodically, patiently dismantling all of it from the very beginning. I just didn't know it yet. I met Marcus at a mutual friend's cottage weekend up near Wasaga Beach. He was funny and unpretentious in a way that surprised me. Most of the guys in his circle were performatively casual about money in the way that only people with a lot of it can be. Marcus wasn't like that. Or at least, I thought he wasn't. He paid for things without making a show of it, listened when I talked, called when he said he would. After 2 years of dating men who treated relationships like a subscription they could cancel any time, Marcus felt like solid ground. His mother was another story entirely. Patricia came from old Ontario money. Her family had been in real estate development in the Greater Toronto area for 3 generations. She was polished in that particular upper Canadian way, never loud, never obviously rude, but somehow always making you feel like you were one tax bracket short of belonging in the room. She wore blazers to Sunday brunch. She sent Marcus articles about neighbourhood property values. She had opinions about which law firms were the right ones and which hospitals had the better board members. That world. You know the one. From the beginning, she was pleasant to my face, warm even in a technical sense, always hugged me hello, always remembered my mother's name, always asked about my work with what looked like genuine interest. But there was something underneath it that I could never quite name. A slight pause before she laughed at my jokes, a way of complimenting my clothes that made them sound like a brave choice. Small things, the kind of things that when you try to explain them to your fiancé, make you sound paranoid. "She's just formal," Marcus would say. "That's just how she is with everyone." I believed him. That was my first mistake. My closest friend, Renee, had known Marcus almost as long as I had. She and I had been friends since university. We'd been roommates at Carlton for 2 years, went through bad haircuts and worse boyfriends together, stood up at each other's family events, the full history. When Marcus and I got serious, Renee became part of the broader group naturally. She was at the dinner parties, the birthday weekends, the engagement announcement, brunch his parents hosted at their home in Forest Hill. Renee was brilliant and warm and, as it turned out, exactly the kind of person Patricia had been looking for. I found out what had been happening on a Thursday evening in February. Marcus and I were supposed to have dinner. He was 40 minutes late, which wasn't unusual, and then an hour, which was. When he finally walked through the door, he had the look of someone who had been rehearsing something in the car the whole drive home. I knew that look. I'd seen it once before, when he had to tell me he'd lost money on an investment and hadn't told me for 2 months. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table and he said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me out before you respond. I want to tell you I knew immediately. I want to say I could feel it coming." But honestly, when he started talking, my brain kept trying to redirect to something smaller, a work problem, a family thing, something with the wedding venue. Not this. He said his mother had been talking to him. For a long time, apparently. She had concerns about our compatibility. Not about me personally, he was careful to say. Not about me as a person, but about whether we wanted the same things. Whether I was someone who could, and I remember this exact phrasing, move comfortably in the circles that matter for where he was going professionally. I sat very still. I remember staring at the grain of our kitchen table. He kept talking. His mother had introduced him to someone. They'd had coffee, just as friends. But there were feelings there. He was sorry, he was so sorry. He didn't want to hurt me, but he felt he had to be honest rather than go through with the wedding and have it fall apart later. He said that last part like it was a kindness. I asked him who it was. He told me it was Renee. I don't have a clean memory of the next few minutes. I know I didn't cry, not right then. I remember asking, very quietly, how long his mother had been having conversations with Renee without telling me. He said he didn't know the full timeline. I remember thinking that was probably a lie, and I remember not having the energy to push on it. What I did, finally, was ask him to leave. Just for the night. And he did, which somehow made it worse. The fact that he just picked up his keys and went, like part of him was relieved the conversation was over. I called my mother. She drove over from Kanata in 40 minutes flat in February on the 417, and she sat with me on my couch until 2 in the morning and didn't once tell me everything happened for a reason. That's my mother. I want you to know she was the right person in the wrong story. The following week was when I started to understand how deep it actually went. I found out through a friend of a friend that Patricia had been calling Renee regularly for over a year, introducing her to Marcus's colleagues, including her in family events when I wasn't there, quietly building a parallel relationship between Renee and Marcus's world. She had framed it, I was told, as wanting to get to know my friends, wanting to be inclusive, wanting Marcus's social circle to feel like a community. Renee had gone along with it. Whether out of ambition or genuine feeling or some combination, I honestly still don't know, and I'm not sure it matters. What I couldn't shake, for a long time, was a conversation I had with Renee about 2 weeks after everything came out. She called me. She wanted to explain. She said she hadn't planned it, that it had happened gradually, that she felt terrible. And I listened to all of it, and then I asked her one question. I said, "Did you think, at any point in the past year, that maybe I deserved to know what was happening?" She didn't have a good answer. She said she hadn't known how. She said she was scared. She said she kept thinking it wouldn't go anywhere, and then it did, and by then too much time had passed. I told her I needed her not to contact me again, and I meant it. I also had one conversation with Patricia. I didn't plan it. She called me, which surprised me. She said she hoped there were no hard feelings. She said she'd always liked me, and that she hoped I understood she'd only done what any mother would do for her son. She said Marcus's future required a certain kind of partnership, and she thought Renee could provide that in a way that I, with my career and my independent nature, perhaps couldn't. She said it gently. She said it like she was doing me a favor by being honest. I said, if Marcus needed a different kind of woman, that says a lot more about how you raised him than it does about who I am. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she wished me well. I hung up and I sat in my car in a superstore parking lot for 20 minutes. The wedding venue deposit, we'd put down $8,000, was non-refundable. That was the detail that kept hitting me in the most practical, unglamorous way. We'd split it, so Marcus eventually sent me his half back. But it took 3 months and a few pointed texts. The joint savings account took longer to unwind. Getting your financial life untangled from someone else's is its own particular kind of grief, the administrative kind, the kind where you're on hold with your bank for 40 minutes just to remove a name from an account. I stayed in Ottawa for about 6 more months. I tried. I went to work. I saw friends. Different ones. I ran along the river in the mornings because I needed somewhere to put the energy that wasn't toward thinking too hard about any of it. But the city felt small, in the way cities only feel small after a bad ending. I kept running into the edges of the life I'd expected to have. My firm had a regional office in Calgary. I put in for a transfer in August. By October, I was gone. I want to be honest about what the first year in Calgary was like, because I think the version of this story that gets told sometimes skips over the hard part in the middle. It wasn't a clean reinvention. I was lonely in the specific way you're lonely when you've moved somewhere where know your history, which is freeing sometimes and suffocating other times. I worked a lot. I ran a lot. I adopted a dog, a ridiculous 3-year-old rescue husky named Frank, which turned out to be one of the genuinely good decisions of that period. I made friends slowly. I started getting better at distinguishing between people who were good for me and people who were familiar to me, which sounds obvious but is actually a skill you have to learn. I went to therapy for 8 months. I stopped checking Marcus's social media, which took longer than I'd like to admit. And about 1.5 years into Calgary, I met someone. His name is Thomas. He grew up in Lethbridge, went to the U of A, spent several years working in renewable energy project development before starting his own consulting firm. He's patient in a way I wasn't used to, funny without needing an audience, and he makes really good use of a Sunday morning. He also has a mother who, when I first met her at their family home in Lethbridge, pulled me into a hug at the door and said, "We've heard so much about you. We're so glad you're here." Just like that, without the pause. We got married last spring. Small wedding, 40 people, at a ranch property outside Cochrane. Frank wore a bandana. Last November, Thomas and I were in Toronto for a conference he was presenting at. His firm had been brought in on a major infrastructure consultation, the kind of project that gets written about in the Globe. We went to the conference dinner at a hotel in the financial district, the kind of event where everyone is dressed carefully, and the name tags have titles under the names. I saw Marcus across the room before he saw me. He was with Renee. They'd gotten married. I'd heard through the mutual friend network, the way you hear things you didn't ask for. He looked the same, maybe a little more tired. Renee was thinner than I remembered. Thomas was beside me, talking to one of his colleagues, easy and relaxed, the way he always is in rooms like that. I watched Marcus notice me. I watched him register Thomas, the way Thomas was being greeted by people, the way the room oriented toward him a little, the way he carried himself without any of the performance Marcus had always needed. Then I watched Marcus look at Renee, and Renee look back at him, and something passed between them that I recognized immediately, even from across a hotel ballroom. That specific, heavy look the two people share when they are not happy, and both of them know it. They came over. Of course they did. There was no clean way to avoid it in a room that size. Marcus shook Thomas's hand and said something polite about the infrastructure project. Renee hugged me briefly and said I looked great. I said she did too. Thomas was warm to both of them because that's who Thomas is. He didn't know the full story right then, and even later, when I told him, his response was measured and calm, and not performatively angry on my behalf, which I loved him for. The conversation lasted maybe 8 minutes. It was fine. No one said anything terrible. But I noticed Renee didn't mention their marriage, didn't talk about what they'd been doing, didn't lean into Marcus the way you do when you're somewhere together and you're glad to be there. And Marcus, when we said goodbye, looked at me with an expression I can only describe as reckoning. Not regret exactly, something quieter than that. More like someone doing the math on the decision they made a long time ago and arriving at a number they weren't expecting. I didn't feel triumphant exactly. I want to be honest about that too. I felt settled, like something that had been slightly off balance for 3 years had quietly leveled out. Thomas and I walked to dinner afterward, down King Street in the November cold, and I told him the whole story properly, filling in the parts he hadn't known. He listened all the way through without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said his mother did him no favours, and that was exactly right. That was the whole thing, actually, said plainly in one sentence on a November street in Toronto. Patricia had been so focused on building the right life for her son that she'd never stopped to consider whether her version of right was actually good for him. She'd removed the person who genuinely loved him and installed the person who fit her blueprint. And Marcus, who had never quite learned to trust his own judgment over his mother's, had let her. And now he was living inside that blueprint, and from the look on his face across a hotel ballroom, it fit the way things fit when someone else chose them for you. I think about my mother driving to my apartment in Ottawa on that February night. 40 minutes on the 417, no hesitation. I think about what it means to have someone in your corner who is actually in your corner, not managing you toward an outcome, not steering you somewhere that serves their own sense of order. Just showing up. I don't have a clean moral to wrap around all of this. Life doesn't really work that way. But I know that losing what I thought I had in Ottawa, the apartment, the venue deposit, the life I'd imagined, turned out to be losing the thing that was keeping me from finding the actual one. Frank is asleep on the couch right now. Thomas is in the kitchen making coffee. Outside the window, the Rockies are doing what they do on a clear Calgary morning, which is be so overwhelmingly themselves that it's hard to think about anything small. I'm not someone who believes in signs, but I believe in paying attention, and I believe that sometimes the person who tells you you're not enough is the one you should be the most grateful to, because they sent you somewhere better without meaning to. I keep coming back to one small moment that I didn't fully understand until much later. Patricia called me after everything and said she'd only done what any mother would do. She said it calmly, like she was reading from a script she'd long ago decided was righteous, and at the time, sitting in that parking lot, I was too stunned to say what I actually thought. What I thought was, a person who does the right thing doesn't need to call the person they hurt to explain why it was right. That's the part nobody talks about when they talk about people like Patricia. It's not that they're malicious in an obvious way. It's that they've convinced themselves their manipulation is love. They've traded integrity for strategy so many times over so many years that they genuinely can't tell the difference anymore. Marcus grew up watching that. He absorbed it without knowing he had. And when she steered him away from me and toward Renee, he followed because he'd never once been asked to trust himself over her. That's not an excuse. It's just what I've come to understand. I think about my own choices in that time, not just what was done to me, but what I did with it. I could have stayed in Ottawa and let the bitterness settle in, which it very much wanted to do. There were weeks where I woke up and the first thing my brain produced was a list of every small sign I'd ignored. The pause before Patricia laughed, the article she forwarded about real estate Marcus didn't ask for, the way Renee had gone quiet on me in the months before everything fell apart, and I'd told myself she was just busy. I'd been choosing comfort over clarity for a long time. That's the honest version, not stupidity. I want to be fair to who I was then, but a kind of willful softness, a preference for the easier interpretation of things. Learning to see clearly, actually clearly, without flinching at what the clear version shows you. That took time, and it took effort, and it didn't feel like growth while it was happening. It felt like losing things. But I did it. I packed up an apartment, transferred my job, moved to a city where I knew almost no one, and started building something that was entirely mine. Not to prove anything to Marcus or Patricia or Renee, just because I was still here and still capable, and those two facts turned out to be enough to work with. Thomas asked me once, early on, whether I was angry at any of them. I thought about it for a while before answering. I said I wasn't, not really, not anymore. What I felt was something closer to clarity about the difference between people who show up for you and people who manage you. Patricia managed Marcus his whole life and called it devotion. My mother drove 40 minutes on a February highway and sat on my couch until 2 a.m. and didn't say a single useful thing, just stayed. Those are not the same thing. They look similar from the outside sometimes, but they are not the same thing at all. What I know now is that the life you build after something breaks you is more yours than the one you had before. You made different choices to get there. You made them with more information, more honesty, more willingness to sit with difficulty instead of smoothing it over. That's not nothing. That's actually most of it. Frank is still asleep on the couch. The Rockies are still doing their thing outside the window. And I'm still here, clearer-eyed, better loved, and genuinely grateful for the phone call that broke my heart because it sent me exactly where I needed to go.